Connect. Community. Experience.
Back up. Unless you're playing 3 on me, it's 2 more who wanna play some D. In the place to be, who replacing me? The way I ball, got your whole squad chasing me. When I hit the hole, who trying to find out? I'm breaking backboards, call the time out.
No, I won't stay down. I'm gonna rebound. It's a crying shame.
Welcome back to Less Stress Matters. This episode, we will be dealing with Less Stress Matters.
Researchers have known for a long time that stress has negative impacts, not just on psychological, but also on physical health as well.
We'll be dealing with a number of topics dealing with stress.
Imagine standing in front of a boardroom packed with executives. You're the presenter, and you go to pull up the files on your computer, and you realize everything has been corrupted. Can you imagine the sense of dread? There's a name for this physiological response to prolonged stress humans endure. That same physiological response humans have had since the dawn of time is just as prevalent, if not more so, today. It's called General Adaptation Syndrome, and was first described by Dr. Hans Selye.
Way back in the 1950s, a famous stress researcher, Hans Selye, proposed a theory known as the General Adaptation Syndrome model.
Is stress part of the world in which we live in, or is stress something manufactured by each individual?
So, Dr. Selye proposed that the stress response system can be characterized as having 3 distinct phases over time, known as the alarm phase, the resistance phase, and the exhaustion phase. Let's zero in on the first phase, or the alarm phase.
What is the number one stress factor in your life?
Which describes what the stress response system is designed to do: help us to cope with emergency short-term changes in our environment. In response to a perceived change in the environment, the stress response system causes the release of 2 stress-related hormones, cortisol and epinephrine, which together produce a series of changes within the body that mobilize the body's resources for coping with short-term immediate threats. The first of these hormones, epinephrine or adrenaline, initiates a series of changes within the body. For example, an increase in heart rate, an increase in blood pressure, an increase in breathing, an increase in strength, and an increase in the release of sugar from the liver to produce fuel for the muscles. And all of these changes are really terrific if we are running from a tiger, that are less helpful when we are sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic. And the thing is, the stress response system is triggered every time that we feel we are in some trouble, small or large, and this includes all sorts of non-emergency events as well, such as having a fight with your romantic partner. In addition, a second stress-related hormone, cortisol, is also released. Cortisol plays an important role in reducing pain and decreasing inflammation that may occur from injuries following an emergency. Cortisol also acts to help regulate the immune system by decreasing immune response.
There's positive stress and there's negative stress.
Now, moving on to the second stage, known as the resistance phase. The release of epinephrine and cortisol can continue for long periods of time in response to long-term stressors. In our modern lives, there are many potential sources of long-term stress, such as a difficult relationship or financial insecurity, a difficult job, or an illness in the family. The potential causes are innumerable. The key point here is that during the second phase, resistance, the individual is releasing large quantities of these stress hormones over a prolonged period of time. And the consequence of the longer-term release of these chemicals is that the blood pressure is constantly elevated, the heart rate is constantly elevated, muscle tension is also elevated. Blood sugar levels are irregular, and the immune system is suppressed. Now, the human body can cope with these altered metabolic function for some time, weeks, months, years, decades.
Informing you of information dealing with stress reducers.
But eventually, the human body can no longer cope with these elevated metabolic rates, and we now begin to enter the final phase of the stress response model, the exhaustion phase, as the body can no longer cope with the elevated metabolic functions brought on by long-term stress. The outcome during the exhaustion phase now is disease, as different organs and functions of the body become impaired due to the long-term effects of epinephrine and cortisol. And these effects can be varied and really depend on the individual and their individual susceptibility. So the heart and circulatory system, for example, can become damaged from constant elevation, which leads to heart disease, potentially heart attacks, strokes, and even death. The individual can develop diabetes from long-term dysregulation of sugar, and back and neck problems from elevated muscle tension. And the long-term suppression of the immune system by cortisol can lead to the development of all sorts of infectious diseases, such as influenza and worse, and even non-infectious diseases, such as cancer, which can lead to, of course, a premature death. So stress itself can kill.
In the fall of 1985, I left home and traveled to an unfamiliar country. I landed in this place. The experience of this place radically changed my life trajectory. This place horrified me. Yet at some level, it fascinated me. In many ways, I'm still coming to terms with what I saw in this place. Where is it? Beirut? Belfast, Bosnia. Before I tell you, let me tell you about where I grew up. Montreal, Canada is a beautiful, cosmopolitan, and diverse city. It hosted the 1967 World's Fair, the 1976 Olympic Games. Remember Nadia Comaneci and the Perfect 10 in gymnastics? I was there. It's a city that's rich in parks and open space, outdoor cafes, public art, street theater, high-quality housing, and a state-of-the-art public transportation system. My brothers and I grew up in Montreal in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and we felt nurtured by that city. See, Canada has a strong social compact with its citizens. We all know Canada has universal health care, but it's also got a universal child care benefit, paid vacation, guaranteed sick leave, high-quality community resources, parks, recreation centers, and community infrastructure, and highly subsidized post-secondary education. I went to McGill University basically for free. Canada invests in its citizens. When I graduated college, I was told that Johns Hopkins was the best medical school in the world. And in fact, there's a saying at Hopkins, which is, we may not be the best, but there's nobody better. When I landed at Hopkins, I was delighted. I was elated to have been accepted there, and I walked through the doors out into the community, and this is what I saw. I landed in East Baltimore, and I had never seen anything like it. I was being toured around by an upperclassman, and he saw the look of shock on my face. And he said, "What's wrong with you?" And I managed to stammer, "When was there a war here?" And I'll never forget what he said to me. He looked at me with this look of utter disdain. And he said, "What'd you expect? It's the inner city." What did I expect? I was supposed to expect this? These atrocious and dehumanizing conditions were a norm in an American city. And I was left to wonder, is the US really a first world country? I saw children in the clinics at Johns Hopkins. And I couldn't help but wonder, what would have happened to me if I'd grown up in East Baltimore? Would I have been able to attend Johns Hopkins Medical School and become a doctor? What is owed to these children? They didn't create this environment, yet they have to navigate it every single day of their lives. What is the American social compact? Does it even exist? Unlike Canada or other Western democracies, the US doesn't have universal health care. It doesn't certainly have a universal child care benefit. It doesn't have highly subsidized post-secondary education. The US doesn't have much by way of universal social benefit policies at all. This is the land of the so-called American dream. But what are the fundamental agreements that underlie that dream? As I looked around East Baltimore, I had a hard time imagining any social compact whatsoever. And I wondered, for the low-income residents of East Baltimore, whether they really ever had a meaningful shot at the American dream. I noticed something else in East Baltimore. As I wandered around and looked into the eyes of children, I started to notice something that was very disturbing. I noticed an absence of hope, an absence of light. These kids were barraged with a message every single day of their lives that they weren't valued, that they didn't matter. And they internalized that. And that caused frustration and anger and eventually despair and a loss of hope. And as that happened, you could see the lights literally turning off in their eyes. This is what happens to people when they feel they don't have control, when they don't have a sense of agency. I'm going to get back to that a little bit later. So here I was, this young medical student at this prestigious medical school, and I felt like I was learning so much about medicine. But outside the walls of the fortress Johns Hopkins, I had no idea what was happening in the streets. And this question started to incubate in my mind. In America, when it comes to your health, does your zip code matter more than your genetic code? 25 years later, that quote was attributed to me by Forbes magazine as the #1 healthcare quote in 2013. Let me tell you how that came to be. It starts with death. After I graduated Hopkins, trained in internal medicine, I subsequently ended up being the health officer of Alameda County. The health officer's job, and it's a great job for data junkies like me, is to be the registrar of all deaths in Alameda County. There are about 10,000 deaths in Alameda County every year. And each of those deaths has a death certificate. And I have to sign each of those death certificates. So I used to say in Alameda County, you're not dead until I say you're dead. And I knew, having been in East Baltimore, that there was a story to be told in these death certificates, hidden within these death certificates, that we could tell about how opportunity is laid out in a society. On a death certificate, you know what somebody died of. You know what age they were when they died. You know their race, ethnicity, and you know where they lived. And those 4 pieces of data in tens of thousands of certificates can tell you a lot about a community. So we took Alameda County and every neighborhood in Alameda County, and we calculated on average how long people could expect to live in their neighborhood. And that map ended up on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle. Those green areas are neighborhoods where people can reliably expect to live 80 years. The red areas, people can only expect to live about 74 years, and the yellow areas are in between 74 and 80. Now, in the city of Oakland, we found neighborhoods that were close together, within a couple miles of each other, where the life expectancy difference was greater than 20 years. And it wasn't just in Alameda County. I had to go back to Baltimore. I had to see how that played out. In Baltimore, there are neighborhoods where, on average, people only live to 58 years old. We went to Minneapolis, St. Paul.
I'm 36, and that's not really so young. I know I don't act the way I should. Melvin's my friend. We got a Twin Cities bromance. He's taking good care of our neighborhood. I'm Jacob Fry. No, it's not pronounced like Frey.
Cause we elected a brown-eyed mayor. I'm just kidding. We have serious work ahead to eliminate the embarrassing disparities that threaten Minnesota by reduce the prospects and growth of our children and families.
To Seattle, to Philadelphia, to Boston, to New York, to Cleveland, to LA, everywhere we looked, we found life expectancy differences on the order of 15, 20, 25 years in the same city. So what's happening in these low life expectancy communities? Well, very simply put, these communities are functioning like incubators of chronic stress. Our fractured social compact has rendered these places without the basic social, political, and economic infrastructure that people need to be able to pursue the American dream. Bad schools, poor housing, inadequate health care, poor transportation, lack of jobs, high crime, neighborhoods that are policed like military zones, a lack of access to parks, grocery stores, and even in some cases, no access to fresh, safe drinking water. Any human being placed in such circumstances inevitably develops chronic stress. That's what would happen to you, it would happen to me. Chronic stress makes it much more likely that you'll develop cardiovascular disease, diabetes, many forms of inflammation. That's how the outside world gets under the skin and changes our physiology. In this country, low-income people are physiologically different than high-income people, not because they were born that way, but because we made them that way.
I never meant to put 1,000 pounds of stress on your head.
Welcome back to Less Stress Matters. People of poverty, the state of being extremely poor, lack of normal resources, social, economical, and political, no means of basic needs, shelter, medical, food, clothing, human rights, violence, and sustainability. The 2018 federal poverty level for one individual is $12,140. For a family of two, is $16,460. Again, thank you for watching Less Stress Matters. Let's return to the rest of the program.
With our policy, or more often it's the absence of policy in the face of abject need. And that policy creates a high degree of social vulnerability so that these communities, like in East Baltimore, are susceptible to any threat that comes along, whether it be a foreclosure crisis, HIV/AIDS, a heroin epidemic, or even a hurricane. So our policy is literally making people sick and killing them prematurely. How does this work physiologically? Well, the body perceives a stressor through the brain. The hypothalamus sends a message to the pituitary gland, sends a message to the adrenal glands, which release a cascade of hormones, amongst which cortisol is one. Low-income people in this country are awash in cortisol. And it's not just low-income people in their cities, low-income people that are living in America's Rust Belt. Our working-class communities are increasingly facing the same kind of stressors. This kind of chronic stress actually changes physiology, it changes your behavior, and it changes how your genes are expressed. So chronic stress, which is driven by the policies that we have created, is as lethal as any knife or any gun. It's not just low-income people. The US life expectancy now is 43rd in the world and slipping. So we know that 80% of what affects our health happens outside the healthcare system. Yet we still operate through the medical model. The medical model basically says that bad behavior produces disease, which produces premature death. So we use ambulances and emergency rooms to try to prevent death. We use 15-minute clinical encounters to try to change the course of disease. And we use brochures and pamphlets to try to change people's behavior. And this is necessary, but it's a $3 trillion enterprise. It's bankrupting us, and it's not improving our health. But there's so much more to this story. The low-income people in East Baltimore didn't create East Baltimore. Government policies and private policies created East Baltimore. Why? Because of a narrative of exclusion. A narrative says that those low-income populations are not entitled to a fair and robust social compact. And the consequence of this is dramatic. And it's not just low-income people. Increasing data suggests that white, educated, and insured populations in this country are in much worse health than their peers internationally. This broken social compact hurts all of us. I'm not immune. You're not immune. The fate of this child is all of our fates. So there's no pill, MRI, or fancy surgery that's going to solve this problem. So rather than using the old prescriptions, it's time for a new prescription for health. Rather than asking people to beat the odds, it's time to change the odds. And that's what we're doing. We're working to create a whole new approach to health in California. We put $1 billion on the table. It's a $1 billion bet that we can prove that there's a better way. We're organizing people to come together to reweave California's social compact. And these people are taking control of their environment, and they feel agency. Let me tell you what this looks like. Fresno, California. If any of you had lunch today, you probably had fruits or vegetables that came from Fresno. It's the 20th Congressional District, one of the poorest congressional districts in the United States. It also feeds the world. In 2014, the Board of Supervisors in Fresno decided that they wanted to cut off health care to 5,600 low-income, undocumented Fresnans, many of whom are farm workers who are feeding us every day as they toil in the fields. But then something happened. People stood up, advocates, activists, and they said, no, this will not happen on our watch. They organized, they came to the Board of Supervisors and they said, you will not do this. And the Board of Supervisors backed down. In the Fresno school systems, young people organized because 15,000 kids are suspended and expelled in Fresno every year. Young people organized and they went to the district and they said, no, you won't do this. We don't want to be fed from the school to prison pipeline. And they forced the district to adopt restorative practices, and suspensions plummeted 43%. And it's not just in the school system. In South Fresno, where they're 1/4 the number of parks that you have in North Fresno, people got together, they organized, they held press conferences, they talked to the mayor, and they forced the city to update its parks master plan. And just this week, Governor Brown signed a bill that brings $70 million to Fresno to address that inequity. Let me tell you about Long Beach. In Long Beach, the port of LA Long Beach is one of the largest ports in the United States. It wanted to expand its rail yards to run 8,000 trucks through a neighborhood in Long Beach that already has high rates of asthma, high rates of cardiovascular disease, and high rates of emphysema. People organized, they said no, and they got the port to back down. In Coachella, in the United States, in 2016, there are places in this state where people can't get access to safe, potable drinking water. 150,000 Eastern Coachella Valley residents had no access to safe drinking water. They organized, changed the way that the water district did elections, and now they have a representative and an opportunity to get infrastructure for themselves in the Eastern Coachella Valley. I could tell you about Richmond, where violent crimes are plummeting because of work being done there. I could tell you about City Heights, where Muslim students now have access to healthy halal meals. The odds are changing in California. 50,000 people working together to create a new social compact, and it's yielding results. Hundreds of policies all over the state, 300,000 fewer suspensions and expulsions in California over the past 3 years. 5 million people newly insured. 1 million people now eligible to reclassify their felonies into misdemeanors. 250,000 undocumented kids eligible for full scope health benefits. California is changing. We're changing the narrative. We're building a social compact for everyone. How long will you live? Go to our website, put in your address, and you'll find out. Go to our website, put in your address, and you'll find out. You may be surprised. Thank you.
Once again, welcome back to Less Stress Matters. Real life, real stress, less stress matters.
Pack up, unless you're playing 3 on me. It's 2 more who wanna play some D. In the place to be, who replacing me? The way I ball, got your whole squad chasing me. When I hit the hole, who trying to find out?
We're talking about police officers now, and a lot of these cases that we continue to see. There's a case right now in Dallas that's all over the news. The young man who was shot and killed in his own apartment. Things that concerns me, especially with police officers, because you do have that responsibility. You do carry a gun. You do carry a badge. And every day when you go out, lives are at stake, yours and other people's. Mm-hmm. You know, he was a straight A student and he never been in any trouble. It shouldn't matter.
Shouldn't, right.
Because if you are innocent and you haven't done anything, it doesn't matter if you are a pastor or a prostitute.
Her account of what happened was self-serving. Like, she said that she walked to the apartment and gave him verbal commands to stop.
You don't get to give somebody verbal commands in their home. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you're so disoriented that you don't know where you are, but you're able to follow police protocols, what you're saying. But up until that point, you're so disoriented, you don't know anything. Mm-hmm. Of course it's self-serving. Problem.
So what can happen to her? Let's say everything she said was true. It was an accident. She walked into the wrong apartment, but somebody still died. What could happen to her?
You said it wasn't.
Let's say it was an accident. Let's say everything she said, it was an accident. She really walked into the wrong apartment.
Yeah.
She made a mistake, but somebody still died. What could happen to her?
Assuming all of that is true, she should still be charged with murder. It was when she fired the gun, that was an intentional act. That is murder.
So not manslaughter?
I think that manslaughter is not a strong enough charge in this case because it wasn't a reckless shooting. The shooting was intentional.
True.
Was she reckless in the fact that she went in his apartment? Yes, that was the reckless act. The shooting itself wasn't reckless, and I think she should be charged with murder.
Do you feel
the entire story has changed to be self-serving, but that's what we see happen in a lot of police shootings, especially when it comes to unarmed Black people, because police officers don't get convicted for shootings, by and large. There was that one case in Dallas that just happened, Jordan Davis, Jordan Edwards. The police officers were Oliver. Mm-hmm. He was just convicted. That was the first conviction in 45 years. She did go to the wrong apartment, but at the same time, you don't get you were off duty. You don't get the protections. You don't get to stand behind the fact that you're a police officer and get special treatment. And that's what's happening in that case right now. She wasn't arrested for 3 days. Mm-hmm. Any other person, you go into someone's home and you shoot and kill them in their home, they're putting cuffs on you.
Absolutely.
And you're walking away in cuffs. And that did not happen with her. So from that moment, I knew she's getting special treatment. She's getting preferential treatment. And that's a problem.